Section 5. How to access reality. De Spagna complains that independent reality refuses to tell us what it is, or what it is like. On the other hand, it does condescend to let us know to some extent what it is not. As he says, it does not conform to the classical schemes of mechanics, of atomistic materialism, or of objectivist realism. In short, to any variant of near-realism. Given all this, De Spagna decides to describe reality in itself as distant. It therefore appears, he says, more or less chimerical to hope ever to construct a scientifically exact, implying the absence of all arbitrariness, model of it, using concepts borrowed from mathematics, as Einstein hoped. Consequently, it seems proper to describe it as either as unknowable or as veiled. Having considered both these terms, De Spagna opts for the second, veiled, as the more correct. This is the case, he claims, because if independent reality were absolutely unknowable, it could not even suggest anything to us. If this were the case, then the only scientific concepts we could have would be those which are embedded in the structure of our minds, as the philosopher Kant believed. However, De Spagna insists that now we know that the evolution of physics since Kant has invalidated that conclusion. This lends plausibility to the idea that independent reality, though not knowable in the usual sense of the term, a sense which we have seen implies the possibility of precise, exhaustive knowledge, is not absolutely unknowable. Once more, it is veiled. De Spagna invokes an analogy inspired by an idea from Bertrand Russell in order to illustrate this notion of veiled reality. In this analogy, independent reality is compared to a musical concert, while empirical reality is compared to a recording of the concert on, say, a disc. As De Spagna says, obviously the pattern of the disc is not totally independent of the structure of the concert, but obviously too, the recording, consisting of a spatial arrangement in the form of minute hills and hollows in grooves, cannot be identified purely and simply with the concert, which is arranged in time. It would be clearly absurd to suppose that the concert and the disc constitute one and the same thing. Besides, a Martian who landed on Earth and discovered the disc would never, by studying its detailed spatial structure, be able to reconstitute the concert, whatever abilities he might be endowed with. Is that to say that studying it would give him no ideas about the concert whatsoever? Clearly, that would be wrong, since he can indeed get to know the abstract structure of the concert in a quite quantitative way too. If he is imaginative, and if he is endowed with hearing, he may be able to guess that the hills and hollows he is studying owe their origin to the emission of sounds. Perhaps he could go as far as to picture to himself in some detail how this was done. But if he sets off on that path, he cannot but be aware of the inevitable arbitrariness inherent in his proceedings. De Spagna suggests that our relation to independent reality is like that of the Martian to the concert. Just as he can both grasp and appreciate the essentials of it, so can we discern and appreciate some very significant features of the real. However, he adds that to say that we know it in the exhaustive sense of knowing would be once again mistaken. De Spagna moves on to consider the implications which this dichotomy between independent and empirical reality may have for thinking about life and consciousness. He considers the notion that independent and empirical reality are ontologically to be put on the same footing, but then concludes that plainly they are not. Indeed, given that empirical reality is by definition the ensemble of those phenomena that human beings can become acquainted with, the question of its accord with independent reality becomes essentially that of the relation between human consciousness and such reality. This question, in its turn, raises the question of the relation between life and independent reality. De Spagna then asks, must we put life rather on the side of independent reality or on the side of empirical reality? While nowadays we tend to see life as essentially a particular ensemble of phenomena which operate at the macromolecular level, he goes on to say that we seem to be in no position at present to make any hard and fast claim as to whether life is or is not reducible to physics. Nevertheless, it is true on the one hand that currently there is no convincing argument that it is not, while on the other there are two facts of a very general kind that tend to support the reductionist thesis. The first is that simple equations may have highly complex solutions. The second is that the emergence of order from disorder, which as is well known, is characteristic of certain phenomena that are at the same time open and out of equilibrium. Undeniably, the balance is in favor of a moderately reductionist thesis. The characteristic features of life seem to be capable of inclusion without fundamental conceptual difficulties among the grand ensemble of that totality of phenomena we have agreed to call empirical reality. But is consciousness also moderately reductive and capable of inclusion in empirical reality? De Spagna starts his answer by saying that consciousness is always associated with life, and that therefore consciousness follows in some way via the intermediary of life from the phenomena of physics. Though here, de Spagna warns against the habit of conceiving everything in mechanistic terms. This is especially a danger, he says, for people whose scientific education has been elementary. De Spagna states that it is certainly true that the complicated arrangement of the macromolecules which make up living cells can, in the main, be described in mechanical terms. This is because the more the dimensions of a physical system approach the macroscopic scale, the greater the degree to which the laws of classical physics, and hence mechanistic descriptions, constitute normally acceptable approximations to the laws which truly govern the system, which of course are quantum laws. The macromolecules involved here are generally large enough for this kind of approximation, which has the advantage of being relatively simple, to be perfectly adequate for the kind of problems to be dealt with. It is therefore quite understandable that we are usually satisfied with descriptions of biological phenomena that are expressed in terms of classical laws. On the other hand, such laws can, as we know, be stated in terms of strong objectivity. If that were true at all scales, it would be possible to give them the status of descriptions of reality in itself, and it would be legitimate and not at all unreasonable to consider the physical objects to which they refer as existing in themselves. This natural chain of thought, says D'Espagne, can lead to mistakenly believing that the molecules, for example, in a living organism, are truly objects whose existence is quite independent of the human mind. If we think in this way, it can become normal to consider consciousness as a simple emanation from some or other of these molecules or aggregates composed of them. But D'Espagne assures us that if, on the other hand, we bear in mind that giving way to it is incoherent, such a way of seeing things itself becomes illogical. Indeed, he continues, we should remember that molecules, e.g., those in the brain, are phenomena, and in a theory whose objectivity is only weak, which he suggests is the case with modern biology, phenomena amount essentially to appearances that are valid for all. Since the notion of an appearance obviously is meaningful only if the concept of a state of consciousness is first posited, then clearly the merely weak objectivity of the true quantum laws tends to reverse the order of subordination. Instead of the existence of consciousness following from the existence of objects, the existence of objects now seems somehow to follow from the prior existence of consciousness or consciousnesses. In other words, consciousness is necessarily prior to phenomena, since the latter is defined in terms of appearances valid for all, that is to say, in terms of consciousness. But, says D'Espagne, this conclusion in no way negates the obvious fact that consciousness seems always to be associated with an empirical reality that is material. How to reconcile these two facts, which at first glance seem to rule out one another? D'Espagne suggests that it can be done by conceiving thought and empirical reality as two complementary poles which give rise to each other within the realm of independent reality. This sounds to me very much like dual aspect monism and is very close to Hodgson's view, which we'll look at in Unit 7.